Welcome to the Relationship Hub. I'm Michaela, and today I'm joined by Claire and Steve Musters, who are going to tell me their relationship story. It's a story of vulnerability and of tangible hope as they share how they overcame extreme difficulties, including loneliness, betrayal and separation. The Relationship Hub is the place where you can hear from real couples about their real relationship story, without pretense, without filters. Claire and Steve are not only sharing their unfiltered story with me today, but they have also done so in their brilliant book, Grace-Filled Marriage. Claire and Steve are Christians, and so their faith is central to their experiences and therefore their story and their book. However, their honest story of fighting for their marriage will touch you whether you're someone of faith yourself or not. Claire is a writer, speaker and author, and together Steve and Claire lead their local church in Sutton in London. They've been married for nearly 30 years and have 2 children. So Claire and Steve, it is really great to have you both on the Relationship Hub. Thank you so much for being willing to tell your story. So let's begin with the very beginning. I always start this way with these interviews. It's good to understand a bit about how you met, how old you were, and how all of that led to marriage.
Well, we were actually really young. We met in our local youth group, and Claire was probably around about 12.
Yeah, I was 12.
That is young.
I'm a couple of years older than Claire, as you could probably tell. But we basically became really good friends, remained good friends as we grew up into our later teens. I ended up doing a gap year in Tanzania, and we came back. After coming back from that, we struck up our friendship again, and we realized that if this was becoming more than just good friends. And I remember getting a little bit panicky about that. I thought this might actually ruin our friendship if things go wrong. And I remember saying to a close friend of mine, I can see this going either two ways. It's either going to ruin our relationship, our friendship, or I'm going to end up getting married to her. And thankfully it was the latter. So I think you're at the end of your second year of uni. We got married. Claire was still, I think, just 20. I was 21. So yeah, still very young.
That is really young. Were people at the time feeling as though maybe you were too young? I mean, was everybody for this, or was there a bit of kind of questioning over that?
I think our parents, because we'd known each other a long time, I think our parents were quite happy, but my parents separated when I was quite young, so my biological dad had quite a few questions.
Right.
But generally, I think because we'd been together for quite a long time, I mean, we weren't, as he said, we weren't a couple from the age of 12, but no. we had because we'd known each other a long time. I think I actually, when we talked it over with my parents, I thought they'd say, well, you must finish uni, you must find a job. And they were all like, no, get engaged, it's great. So they were all for it. So we were quite surprised. But yeah, it just seemed the natural thing to do.
Yeah, and I guess as well, you've spoken about friendship there, and it's one of those foundational things that we sometimes overlook, that friendship is just the start of these things, and it's such an important part of relationships working and clicking. So how was it being married? So you've gone, particularly, Claire, you're at uni and suddenly you're kind of thrust into married life. How was that? How were those early years of marriage?
Well, it was lovely to set up home with Steve, but not that long before we got married, he'd landed his dream job in a recording studio, but working from the bottom up. But even when you are producing, you are working round the clock. So I entered marriage full of all the romantic ideals. I was very young. I just thought everything was going to be perfect. And the reality of it, I was studying hard doing my dissertation, and I didn't have my husband around. So I went from living in a house with lots of people to basically being on my own. And that continued. I got a great job in a publishing company as soon as I finished uni, but I was commuting into London every day, coming back to an empty home, and often I was going to bed on my own. And actually, we quite often used to meet each other over breakfast, or as I was leaving to start my commute, he was coming back from a really, really long day, just have a few hours sleep before he went back off again. So we very rarely saw each other, and he worked a lot of weekends. So actually the reality, I kind of came back down to earth with a huge bump. It's like, this is not really what I was expecting, not really what I signed up for. So it was actually really hard.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Steve, were you going to say something then?
No, I was just going to say we were proverbial ships passing in the night. So we ended up starting our marriage off very separately, living separate lives, pursuing separate careers, with very little interaction. And, the time we did have together, sort of weekends that I did have off, I was basically like an empty husk of a person. So, yeah.
Whereas I would be getting all worked up thinking, this is amazing. I'm going to see him for a weekend. We could do this, we could do that. And then the reality of that, I was hugely disappointed because it was just exhausted. Yeah. So I had unrealistic expectations, but he could not really interact in the way that I was desperate for, because he was exhausted and it was a very grueling workload he had.
So Steve, did you realise at the time that this was perhaps not the best way to start off married life? Were you conscious of that, or did you just kind of plough on because your job had its demands? I mean, what were your thoughts at that time?
Yeah, I kind of I threw myself into my work. It was a massive opportunity I got, and very selfishly, I just threw myself into it. I would kind of rationalize with Claire that, well, what if I was in the armed forces? What if I was, a doctor? They have incredibly long hours. Yeah. What's the difference, kind of thing. So I'd try and rationalize it, but I knew it wasn't perfect, but I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know where to turn, how to change things. So sort of resigned myself to, well, we've just got to make the best of it. Maybe things will change. So basically resorted to apathy, if I'm honest.
Because in your book, you said it is interesting how quickly you can become comfortable with dysfunction. So I assume that's what you're alluding to there. Can you explain a bit more of what you mean by that?
Yeah, when I was thinking about this, I was reminded when we first moved into our house we are in now, there was this really ugly lampshade in the dining room.
It was awful.
I remember thinking when we were looking around, that is the first thing that's going to go. Strangely enough, though, other priorities got in the way, doing up the bathroom, the kitchen. And we ended up living with that lampshade for 2.5 years before finally going, that's still here. That's got to go. And so it just reminded me how easy we get used to things that are not right, just because A, we don't have that priority, or B, we just don't know what to do about it. And for me, it was particularly with our relationship, it was the latter. I didn't know how to change things. So we kind of, or I at least kind of ignored it. Claire would have just say, this is enough. I can't cope with this situation, probably about once or
couple of times
a year. And things would die down again. We'd get back to kind of just the routines, the rut, if you like, that we had fallen into. So, yeah, I knew there was a dysfunction there, but we just kind of got used to it, mainly because we didn't know, or I didn't know what else to do about it. It became just part of our life.
Part of the routine of how you do things, almost. Yeah. And for you, Claire, then, I mean, obviously you said that, you entered marriage thinking, this is going to be wonderful, that sort of romantic notion, and then it's difficult, it's hard. So how over time did this impact you in terms of, particularly if you're saying every now and then, come on, let's sort some things out. What happened to you personally?
Yeah, well, I found it really difficult, and I kept myself incredibly busy, because if I was in the house by myself, the loneliness just overwhelmed me, and I couldn't cope with that. So when I first worked in the publishing company, I would work really hard, but also play really hard. I'd go out to the pub after work most nights. As you say, we're Christians, so when I realised actually that's not so healthy for me, I got more involved with church, got involved in the music team there. So I was doing a lot of stuff. But actually, deep down, I knew that what I really wanted to do was to be doing more with Steve. So I did every so often say, look, I just can't carry on like this. Something's got to change. But like Steve, I just didn't really know what to do about it. And I also felt it was his dream job. It's incredibly difficult to get into the music industry. It was amazing he'd done that. And I didn't feel like I could ask him to give that up. I mean, we had those conversations, but there was nothing else he really felt passionate about, nothing else he was trained for. And so, yeah, I guess I just shut up and got on with things. But actually it affected my health because I found it really difficult to sleep when he wasn't around. So I actually ended up being diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, which was not very helpful. And so I thought, well, maybe I've got to make some changes. And actually that was kickstarted by my boss actually went freelance. And that it made me a bit unnerved. And then I started thinking, I wonder whether that's something that I could do. And within a short space of time, I was offered 6 months amount of work as a freelancer, which is quite unheard of. So I thought, well, I've got all this work. I'm going to take the plunge. And so I did. And there were lots of positives with that. By this point, we were living in Wimbledon and a lot of friends worked locally. So I could see them at lunchtime. I could wake Steve up when I had my morning tea break and sit and have a cuppa with him while he was having breakfast. So I saw him a little bit more. But it actually meant, obviously, I was no longer in a busy office. And actually, it did compound the feelings of loneliness at times because I was on my own an awful lot. So there were some changes that we tried to make, but that not deep enough. Down feeling of loneliness was still there.
Yeah, and I think actually as you're telling this story, I'm thinking that so many people would surely relate to that sense of, as you say, you don't want to stop the other one pursuing their dreams and like great opportunities coming up. And this is so exciting and this is so good. And it's almost that sense, well, the relationship is there. We've done the relationship. We've made promises on our wedding day. It'll probably be okay. You can almost convince yourself and forget that actually relationships need that continual kind of investment. And I mean, we'll get onto your story a bit more, but I just want to take a moment to think, what would you say to couples now who are in a situation maybe where actually work is too full on? What do you think you could have done differently at that time just to stop things at that point?
Good question.
Well, I think it's the always assuming that everything's going to be okay, that the relationship will still be there. And I think because we'd grown up together, we'd known each other for so long, I think that we made a lot of assumptions about each other. Yeah. And I think that's the thing. I mean, we did talk when we could, but I think actually making a bit more space and a bit more effort and actually dedicating time to one another in a way that perhaps, I mean, we were a young married couple. We were one of the few people in our friendship groups that had a garden. And so quite often at the time that Steve did have off, we had piles of people just turning up unannounced and just wanting to be with us and use our garden. And we were like, yeah, great. Actually, maybe we should have prioritized our relationship more. Yeah. And actually said, hold on a minute, we need some space just to ourselves. The whole thing of not asking your partner to give up on their dream is a really difficult one. And actually, I think it'll come out in our story that we didn't see a way, but actually there was, which I think you will come on to. And so I think actually thinking outside of the box a bit more and being willing to push boundaries and maybe just chat, and also chat with the people that you work for, the people that you are around and you do life with, because actually people are surprisingly supportive when they realize that actually your marriage is getting under so much pressure.
And I just, it's very easy to lose hope when you can't see any way forward and you don't see any change. It's very, very easy to lose hope. And I think just keeping open lines of communication, trying out small things, like we probably should have done, communicated a lot more rather than allowing it to just stew under the surface and then declare to explode, twice a year. But actually,
that's so well.
And just keeping those lines of communication regularly open and just saying, are we okay? And what can we do? No, we're not okay. Okay, well, what steps? Just so there's some sense of ongoing working this out together. It's not just dumped on one person's lap or the other. So there's probably a million different things we could have done a lot better. But as Claire said, we did eventually find a way forward. But
Yeah,
obviously
okay.
after it
We
went
can.
horribly wrong.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously it did all sort of come to a head, and I think you talked about a wake-up call, Steve, in the book.
Yeah.
But what did happen? What was the point where, okay, we really have gone to a certain point here? What happened?
Well, that was me. And on reflection, I don't know that I would have jumped ship if I didn't have somebody to go with, because, as I said, it was loneliness that was driving me. But we moved to where we live now, and that was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
This all happened. So we've been here a long time now. And actually, we got quite close to another couple, and it was when the guy in that couple started talking to me about the fact that he felt very similar in his own relationship. And so we started sharing, and it didn't take long, and I didn't really realize what was happening before we got very emotionally attached. I was just so relieved that another married person understood, because I think we didn't know that many married couples, because, as I said, we got married quite young, but also those that we did know, everybody else seemed to have a perfect relationship. And so we didn't
Apparently.
we didn't really want to open up and talk about our difficulties, because it looked like we were the only ones who were struggling. So to find somebody who was willing to admit that, yeah, things aren't that great, was a huge, well, I just kind of jumped on that and thought it was amazing, but didn't realize how attached I got. And then he came to me one day and just said, I'm going to leave. Will you come with me? And I was actually really shocked at the time. And then I thought, well, what do I do? Had a few nights of, I have no idea what I'm going to do now, but I was desperate not to lose that person who seemed to understand me and understand where I was at. So actually, I then chose to leave with him. So that was the big change that happened.
That's a big change.
Yeah.
And Steve, so how was that for you? What happened from your point of view?
Yeah, I think, as Claire said, we had made so many assumptions about our relationship. And one of those assumptions was, however bad things got, we'd always be together, right? And that was just the assumption. So when the door closed, literally, I literally just crumbled. I just, physically fell on the floor. I could not believe how I had let us get to this point. And I mentioned it in the book, it was just this overarching sense of, how could I have been so complacent? How could I have let us get to such a point where it was, to all intents and purposes, over, finished. So, yeah, absolutely. Rug pulled out of my feet, wind out of my sails, just totally knocked for six. For quite a while.
Really, I'm sure it must have been very, very hard for you, and for you as well, Claire, because, as you say, you're in this place where finally you're feeling as though this loneliness that you've been experiencing is being kind of dealt with, and you're not having that same sense of loneliness. But there must have been a bit of a tug of war going on, perhaps, in your thinking and trying to kind of do the right thing. I mean, what was happening to you internally while this was all happening?
It was a huge, difficult, tumultuous time, because it went everything against my faith, because I believe in marriage. I believe it's for life. And obviously the response that I got from my family, they could not believe that I'd done this. I couldn't actually believe I'd done it either. So there was that rush of excitement for the first few days. And then things settled down, and actually I missed Steve. He was my best friend, and the thought, I actually remember going to visit my sister, and she had young children at the time, and actually I got quite upset because we didn't have kids at this point, and I thought, I'm never going to know what mine and Steve's kids would have been like, and I actually got quite upset. So there was I had a huge amount of attachment to Steve, but also as time went on, this other guy became more and more distant, and so the loneliness came back, and I was thinking, what have I done? Have I made a huge mistake? Well, I've made my bed now, I've got to lie in it. So there was a lot of questions. It was actually really scary, but I thought, well, I'm here now, I can't do anything about this. So it was another point of, I feel a bit trapped. This is the decision I've made. this is it now. So that it was quite hard. So after the first few flushes, I was like, oh my goodness, this might not be quite what I was expecting either.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, that relationship did come to an end. Tell me a little bit about what happened.
Yeah,
and then
very quickly, which was, so as I said, we had a few days which were lovely. And then within a couple of weeks, he just, as I said, he'd been getting more and more distance, and he came to me and sat down and said, look, I've watched the way that I've given you space, that some of the areas, like he was a great cook, and so that was always his domain in his marriage. He said, I've been letting you cook alongside me, and he said, he actually said God spoke to him and said, look, you've been giving Claire space, you've been doing all those things that you should have done for your wife, you now need to go back and do that for her. And so he just sat down, said that to me, and walked out the door. Wow. And I was absolutely shocked, and was like, well, if you were giving me space, does that not mean that I'm the person you're supposed to be with? And so I was full of questions, and obviously completely and utterly flawed, felt totally rejected, but also I was like, well, this decision I've made has cost me my husband, my home, my church family, and probably my professional career, because I'd been asked to write a series of books based on my faith, and thought, well, I can't do that now after what I've done. And so I felt like I'd lost everything. I felt really stupid, really foolish. But tellingly, Steve was the first person, which actually was quite cruel, but actually instinctively I rang him, because as I said, he was my best friend, and so he was the first person that I told.
So over to you, Steve, I think is this point.
Well, as I said, we have a faith, so I obviously have been praying a lot, just actually for a change, a situational change, that somehow this situation could turn around. I knew I wanted to fight for our marriage. I think I'm an eternal optimist. So I just thought there's always a way. There's always a way back. So the moment I heard Claire's voice, I thought, right, the fight is on. This is now an opportunity to rebuild, repair, restore. And again, being the eternal optimist, I hadn't really factored in the length of time and the healing that Claire would need, that we'd both need. But yeah, that was certainly, it was a shock, but it was also a glimmer of hope that actually maybe things could be turned around.
Yeah, okay. And that's actually says a lot about your faith, doesn't it, as well? Because I think this is one of those situations where couples, when they're talking about their marriage or their relationship and the things that are well, if you go to a certain level, there's no way back. And some people would say this is a no way back. And it's not as simple as what Claire has done. It's about both of you and what led to that point. But often this is the thing. People look at that thing that's happened and say there's no way back. And actually you're demonstrating that the opposite you felt was absolutely true. What where was that strength? What did you, I know you said it's your faith, but did you feel like this could happen, or was it just internal optimism? I mean, I'm interested to kind of understand that sort of thought process at that time.
Yeah, I guess because I understood, or was beginning to understand, where Claire had been for much of our marriage. And I could begin to understand, what had propelled her to make that decision. I knew it was out of character. I think there was a sense of, we've called our book Grace-Filled Marriage. And for me, it was about understanding grace, that we had tried to work things through for years in our marriage. It wasn't something that was a character trait of Claire, or something that I had nothing to do with. So I think, the moment I thought, actually, those vows I said to Claire, and we said to each other, right, on our marriage day, I remember going back to those and saying, do I still hold on to them? Do I still believe them, for better or for worse? And I came to the conclusion, yes, I did. I did still mean them. And I really wanted to throw everything I had at getting back.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So what did the fight look like? You said the fight was on. How did that transpire? What happened next?
Probably me annoying Claire an awful lot. Yeah. So, well, I mean, you went back down to your parents, didn't you?
Steve actually helped me move, and I took some time. And I think part of what Steve had to learn is that the fight quite often looked like giving me some space and some time. And that was, I know, was really frustrating for him. And there were moments where I could see that. And I was like, well, I am trying, but actually I'm not ready yet. So I did a lot of wrestling. I did a lot of looking and self-reflection and realizing that I had struggled with self-worth for most of my life, and having everything taken away from your life and not knowing. I mean, I knew Steve was keen for us to get back together, but I was like, I've got to take this time and space before I understand whether we can make it work. Yeah. But also to just really look at my life again. And by this point, I was approaching 30, I think.
Yes.
And it was a time of, wow, I've got to reflect and see, what have I actually done with my life? Where have I been placing my values, my sense of purpose, my sense of who I am? So I did a lot of wrestling about that. But obviously, I was also dealing with a lot of rejection, huge rejection that was not helped by the other guy contacting me a few times, and I'm not sure if I've made the right decision. So I kept waving. And people were saying to me, well, you just need to get back together with Steve. And in my head, I knew that made sense. But actually my heart wasn't in that place yet. And I thought, I can't do that until I've worked through some things. And so, I mean, Steve came to see me very regularly, and sometimes he would do romantic gestures. And that was part of his fighting for me. And sometimes I could accept them, and sometimes I found it really difficult. And I know that was really hard for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that period when you were at your parents', I had to really learn patience, and that, you know, Claire was dealing with some deeper issues perhaps that I was even unaware of at the time. And yeah, giving Claire space was so important, and a massive lesson for me to learn, and a really hard lesson, because I'm a fixer. I like things, you know, tick things off the list, let's go, and just to actually have very little control, you know, no control at all, just had to release it, and just wait for Claire to be ready, because there's no way I wanted her back when her heart wasn't there, or her heart wasn't in it. So you know, just had to get to that point and learn some good old patience. Was and probably very hard.
It's interesting, that whole idea, because, you know, as you've just said, I'm going to fight for this. And then when people think about fighting, they think about being active and doing. And yet I'm going to fight for this, and then just sit and wait and do the right thing in that way, which is commendable, because I can imagine, as you said, that you were probably impatient to try and restore things, to get things back on track. So fighting isn't always what we think it's going to be, is it? It can often be a very different sort of expression of love, actually, in this situation. So how long were you apart for, and what do you think it was that enabled you to reconnect? What was the moment for you, Claire, do you think, when things began to feel as though, okay, I'm processing the rejection, the insecurities, the loneliness and the struggles? What was it that then changed to enable you to come back together again?
Yeah, we were apart for about 3 months. That's how long I was living with my parents. And I think, I think it was a huge thing for Steve, because I think a lot of the messages we were getting from people around us was just get back together. Yeah. And I was go up and down, so emotional in that time. And my mum actually took me aside and said, come on, Claire, you've got to start making some decisions that are positive for you, because you're making yourself ill. And it was actually a phone call that I had with a lady who actually listened to me and understood where I was coming from. And I mean, her husband had been the person who'd facilitated our wedding, and she was the mum of one of the friends that we'd grown up with in youth group. So she was very for us, but she said, I can see there's a lot of hurt here. I can see that there's a lot of pain. And actually, you need to deal with that before you can even start to think about whether you and Steve have a future. And that really turned things around for me, because I started to have some kind of hope that somebody understood, that somebody could see that there was a process, but also that that there was hopefully a way through that. They do a lot of healing ministry and counselling, and so I trusted her, and so something in me just kind of latched onto that, and I thought, okay, there is hope that I can get through this, because I was beginning to really flounder and think that I'm drowning in all of this. And actually, her and her husband suggested that they spent some time with me and Steve. So we went and stayed in the town that they live, and we actually spent a week going in to see them each day, and they would work with us individually and work through things from our past, the different issues that we both had, because I think that's one of the things that you say in the book, that actually when he got impatient with the waiting, that actually he realized that there were things in himself that he needed to work on and hadn't realized either. So we had a lot of time and space with them as a couple, and then they would do things with us together as well. And towards the end of that week, we both felt actually we're ready to renew our vows, and actually we're ready to take that next step. So we did that with just them, which was really lovely. And from that week, I then moved back home.
Yeah, that was a very, very precious week, because there was a lot of relaying, or perhaps at times laying for the first time, some proper foundations, and allowing again that space for us both to heal and just process hurts and all of that stuff. So and I'm not naturally that sort of person, as I said, I'm a fixer. I like to just be active and do things, and just spend a week just reflecting. I don't really do that. I'm now beginning to see, many years on, the value of that. We all need to do that. We need to become so much more self-aware and emotionally intelligent as to what's going on inside, because it does all come out in different ways. So just being able to process that before just jumping back into right, let's start trying to rebuild something, was really key, really important for us.
And I think as well, just, I think it's a really great part of your story that you were willing to open up to this couple, to talk to them, to help them process that with you, because it's very easy to just shut people out actually when things get really difficult. And I think particularly when it comes to marriage, people feel as though we ought to be able to do this well. We shouldn't have to tell people. Nobody wants to talk about struggles and difficulties. And one of the things that I think is marvellous about your book is that the fact that you're talking with me today, because I think people need to be in a place where they talk about the ups and the downs, and it couldn't just be small things, big things, but that you actually find trusted people. And I think it's, a real testament to you, both of you, in terms of that fight to say, I'm going to be vulnerable with this couple and talk to them, Yeah,
and I actually, one of the things that we said earlier that we were going to come back to, I'll bring that out here as well, that actually Steve was really vulnerable with his boss as well. And while I was living away with my parents, because one of the reasons I was reluctant, I was thinking, well, how is this going to change? I'm just going to be going back to the same work situation. And so he went to his boss and really just laid it all out and said, this is what's happened. This is where we're at now. I want to make my marriage work. And his boss, in the industry, by that point, everybody that we knew had split up their marriages, or their relationships had split up anyway. And his boss was lovely. And he said, well, I want to do anything that I can to help your relationship work. And so between them, they suggested that the studio would close at 8:00 every night, which is absolutely unheard of. You're just gearing up to do a session at that kind of time. And people love to sing at nighttime. Your voices are much more open. So it didn't make business sense. But for me to have known that Steve had gone and had that vulnerable conversation really impressed me, but also that his boss was willing to make a huge change. So that's what we were saying earlier about, if you're not sure that there's a way forward, actually speaking to those around you. We would never, when we were sitting down and not being able to find a way through all those years previously, would never have suggested, well, let's go to your boss and suggest they shut the studio every night. And yet that's what came out of it, which was incredible.
Yeah, and I think, it's just sad it took what it did take to actually have the courage to do that, or to think outside the box, as it were. But I'm incredibly grateful to the MD of the record company for agreeing to do that, because, as Claire said, that nowhere else, I didn't know any other recording studio that did that. And as Claire said, it made no financial sense. But it just shows that if you are open and you do talk about your struggles, there are people, even well-meaning employers, who will help.
Yeah. And I think there's something significant about being vulnerable in a safe place, because I think vulnerability enables people to kind of help unlock the situation for you, because they see that you're saying, this is hard, this is where I'm at. And people actually do generally want to help. People that are for you do actually want to help, don't they, in those situations? So, but no, I mean, it's such a great, aspect that you did that, because I think particularly with a boss, you feel like, I really don't want to talk about stuff from home, but actually there are probably lots of other people who are in working situations where they find it hard and it's impacted on their family life, and they feel a bit trapped, that there's nothing they can do about it. But actually your story showing, no, you can do something about this. Think about who you can speak to. So no, that's great. So you've had this great week, and it's been really significant for you, and you're reconnecting and you're coming back home, Claire, to be with Steve. I'm sure that from that point onwards, it wasn't just, okay, we're all fine now. I mean, learning to forgive, learning to trust. I mean, how was that stage? I mean, I think the forgiveness is a really big question, actually, because again, people feel like, okay, well, I'll accept it, but I won't forgive. I mean, you hear people say those things. They do a half-hearted response to it because they don't feel they can. What's been your experience in terms of forgiveness? Yeah,
I mean, I think we came to the conclusion, well, I certainly came to the conclusion pretty quick, that if there was any hope of a relationship, if there was any hope of any depth of relationship, then there had to be forgiveness, and not just surface level forgiveness, but real heart level forgiveness. And I think it helps so much if you think of forgiveness, what forgiveness isn't. Forgiveness isn't denying that person hurt you. Forgiveness isn't saying it was okay. It's not letting them off the hook. In fact, forgiveness isn't for them really at all. It's more about for you. It's refusing, I suppose, to hold on to the pain, refusing to hold on to the hurt, refusing to hold on to the right to justice and to see the other suffer. It does the opposite. You choose to forgive, and the other thing is it's not a one-off. It's a daily choice, and there are still times where things crop up that just trigger old hurts and old memories, and again you're just faced with that choice. No, I've forgiven and I choose to forgive. And so it's a lifestyle. It sounds a bit kind of cliched, but forgiveness is a lifestyle. And I'd say the same thing with trust as well. They're totally entwined, I think. Again, we kind of grow up in an environment where people say you have to earn your trust. And I think there was a tendency in me to begin with, at least, to see how remorseful is Claire really, how repentant is she. Let's just see, if she deserves my trust again, because when someone breaks that trust, it's obviously deeply, deeply painful. But ultimately, again, if there's any hope of a relationship, you have to be willing to kind of put your heart out there again. And any relationship, any sense of vulnerability, there's a risk to getting hurt again. And I remember just making that decision personally, just saying, I choose to trust Claire again. I choose to, put my heart out there again. Yes, there is a risk of getting hurt again. But if there was any hope of any depth of relationship, to forgive and to choose to trust had to be daily decisions for me.
And I think I actually found it, I think once we'd got to the end of that week, I actually found it fairly easy to forgive Steve. And once I came back home, we found counsellors that lived near us. And so we were doing regular counselling. We were working on things together. But actually, it was coming back here from our home. We could see from the back of our house, we could see the other couple's house. And right. I think I kept being overwhelmed with anger that it looked like the other person had been let off the hook. And right. I struggled more with that. And as Steve was just explaining, it's not about letting them off the hook at all. It's about choosing to walk away from the bondage of bitterness if you don't forgive. And I think it was when I understood that, I actually read a book about forgiveness, and that's where I first read about that. And once I understood that, I found it was still really hard. It was a real act of the will to actually say, okay, I'm going to choose to forgive this. But that really set me free. I actually found it harder to forgive myself because what I had done was something that I would never have thought I'd have been capable of. And it actually took me a while. I think I was so hurt and felt so rejected. It took me quite a long time to fully understand the depths of what I'd done and how much it had affected everybody around me. And I think that self-forgiveness is really important as well, because you can't choose to forgive your partner for something but not yourself, because you're keeping yourself locked up anyway. And so I had to work on self-forgiveness quite a bit.
And I like the fact you've just used that sort of sense of unlocking, because I think that's what forgiveness, the way you've described forgiveness today, it unlocks things, doesn't it? It unlocks things for you as you forgive and as you receive forgiveness. And I think sometimes, you see things on the news and you hear stories of awful things that have happened and someone's forgiven, and we just hear those things and some people, oh, that's amazing, I don't think I could do that. And actually it's something that isn't easy for anybody. It's almost like we assume it's easy for certain people, but they haven't been through what I've been, or they haven't experienced what I've experienced. And I think how you've described your process, and as you said, Claire, that importance of forgiving yourself and going through that process, that it's incredibly powerful, and you've done it from a place of pain and difficulty and have chosen to do something about it. And as you've said, it's a choice and it's unlocked things. And I think I almost wanted to hover on that moment, because I think it's very easy just to hear about it from someone else's experience. But you've demonstrated and shown us, I think, that it's something that we can do. It's difficult, but it's this choice, and we can change the direction of how things are.
Yeah.
I think, it's just reflecting on what's the option. The option is to hold on to bitterness, to hold on to pain, to hold on to hurt, and that just festers, and it's literally just poison. It corrupts you, and you just have to let it go.
But I think it's also, just as we said, it's a daily decision, and it's just as important for the little things as it is for the really massive things. Sometimes we can actually hone in and actually get really angry and annoyed on little things and we forgive the big stuff but forget to forgive the little stuff, and that can cause friction in our relationships. And it's just as important, because we do still get annoyed with each other. It's not like our marriage is perfect now. And it's actually those lessons that were really hard fought and hard won. It's actually about remembering to implement them in just daily life, where there may not be a big issue on a particular day, but it's just those little niggles, and you think, actually, I've still got to choose to forgive. I've still got to choose to trust, because this is actually a way of life. It's not just a one-off thing, as Steve said.
Yeah. So how different do you think you both are as individuals and as a couple because of this experience, what you've gone through, the choices you've made, probably feeling like you want to give up sometimes, other times feeling like you're winning, this kind of roller coaster of challenge? How has it changed you, do you think, both of you?
I'd say a lot more humble, because obviously it was all quite a public thing, because being part of a church community, you are quite close knit, and so everybody knew everything about what had happened. So actually one of the hardest things I ever had to do was walk back into our church building and face all of our dear friends again, that was really hard. But again, they showed me a huge amount of love and forgiveness, which I'm very grateful for. And now actually Steve pastors that church. He has had a complete change of career. And so that's really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say we've learned all our lessons. That's so not true. I'd love to say that I never get complacent about our marriage anymore. That's not true. It's amazing how quickly and easily you can slot back into old habits, particularly when you're busy. And you can start to do that again.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, one thing that we are getting better at, and still, because it's a journey, isn't it? It's you never kind of reach that sort of sense of, right, we've nailed this. But just that sense of communication. Are we okay? I think in your book, in the book, you talk about having a vision for your marriage, for your relationship. I think that's really important, because then you could just touch base and say, are we still heading in the same direction together? Are we still kind of together in this? And you know, we do sort of MOTs. We check up on each other like you do with a car. You know, just regularly, just ask each other some questions that hopefully will just help bring that connection again, particularly in busy lives. We've got 2 kids now, and again, I think that's another whole stage of married life. And I think it's so important to keep those lines of communication open and not get complacent. But yeah, we're still learning that one.
Well, I would also say the whole idea of vulnerability is something that's become a big subject for us. And I think if we'd been told at the time when we first got back together that we would be telling our story, that this would be something that we'd be doing, I think we probably would have run a mile. As actually, I mean, as
the irony of it,
Steve's a very private person, and most of us would not go out of our way to talk about what's been one of the most difficult parts of our lives, and for me, one of the most shameful. And yet that's what we feel really passionate about now, because actually even before we felt like we were really back on the road of recovery, not long after I'd moved back home, we started having friends, other couples coming to us and opening up and saying, actually, we've been struggling for a while, and we feel, and all of a sudden we were a safe space because everybody knew everything about us, and it was all out in the open, and they could see we were working at it and trying to put things right. We became this safe space. And I think just being vulnerable gives people permission to talk about things that we don't normally talk about, but it's so needed. And I think we've become quite passionate about that now, which has surprised us. I mean, before this book, I wrote a book called Taking Off the Mask, which was how I felt in that moment when the other guy walked out of the house and I was left on my own. I felt like I'd lived behind this victim mask for all of my 20s, and all of a sudden everything I'd hidden behind was just ripped away, and I felt totally exposed. And going back to church, I felt really exposed, and yet the love they showed me was so freeing, that people know the worst about me and yet they still love me. And I think if you've got people around you who are supportive and who are for you, we can actually be a lot more honest than we have the guts to do so often. So actually, I felt a call to write about our story, and we had to work that through. And that, are we okay about that? And I still find, I mean, I do quite a lot of speaking about it, and still quite often just before I step out to speak, I suddenly think, oh my goodness, what am I doing? It is quite a bizarre thing. It's not a normal thing that we go out and talk about all of this stuff. And even when that book came out, we had no idea, we had no inkling we'd be writing a book on marriage. For us, it felt a little bit ironic. And yet our journey has taught us, if you can be open and honest and share about the things that are difficult, as well as the things that you've learned, it just other people open up, and it just gives that space, and it's what we need. And so here we find ourselves talking to you and having written this book, and we're quite excited about what might happen with it, because I think as we say, we are nowhere near at the end of our journey. We've got so much more to learn, and yet we do feel like this is what part of what we're called to do, is actually just facilitate and just encourage other people to be open and honest, to take that look at their relationship, to be humble enough to think, Are we just ignoring things?
Yeah.
Could we be doing things better? And who could we gather around us that could help support us? Who could we be talking to as well?
Yeah, I think it's a message of hope, isn't it? I think it gives people permission when you are vulnerable, to actually open up and talk. And when people talk, when there's connection, there is hope. And I think particularly through our book, that's what we are hoping for, that actually this really does help start communication, start conversations, start people seeing that actually they don't have to struggle on their own, but that there are people around who are very happy to journey with them. And so it's hopefully a message of hope.
And I mean, actually, you've answered my next question really, which was why you have written such a vulnerable book, and you have answered that brilliantly, and that kind of sense of transparency, because it isn't easy. That you've talked about almost this stripped back kind of marriage, everything pulled away. And in fact, even at this time of pandemic, COVID, all the different challenges, I think there will be lots of couples who will be feeling perhaps stripped back, and they are spending lots of time with their other half, or they've gone through challenges, and it brings things to the fore. And I think we're in a time and a place where, well, I've always felt that we need to talk about relationships more, which is why I do the Relationship Hub, and why I'm passionate about, speaking with couples like yourselves. But I think we're in a time where almost people are seeing that more, perhaps. They are experiencing new things and thinking this is hard. And we do need stories. We need your story. I'm grateful for your story, that you're willing to do that. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, because as you've said, this is not like an easy thing to do. It's not something you think, yay, we'll do this. It's a hard thing, it's a place of pain, but you're doing that is so hopeful. Genuinely, it is such a story of hope. And also in the book, of course, there are other snippets of other people's stories, which I think is a really great thing. I mean, I've had the privilege of reading the book already, and all those little stories there give other people things to relate to and other things to latch onto and think, okay. But there's lots of absolutely sound advice in the book. One question I wanted to ask you, actually, we are kind of running out of time, but I really wanted to ask you about one of the chapters is about grace-filled being sort of dying to self. And I think that's quite countercultural. And in fact, the other thing I wanted to ask you, I've just remembered too, is just to explain a bit more about grace, because we've talked about grace quite a bit, because that's the title of your book. So could you explain grace to us, and then explain grace in terms of dying to self?
Yeah, I suppose for me, the simplest understanding of grace is this sense of undeserved, unearned, unmerited favour. And I think, for us with the faith we have, we understand that we are recipients of God's grace, that he loves us unconditionally. We don't have to earn his love. And I think with any real relationship, in any marriage, that sense of having to earn love, it shouldn't be there. It should be unmerited. And it is this sense of selfless giving. It comes back to that whole issue of forgiveness and trust, and unearning this sense of approval and favor. So it is countercultural, because so often we go into relationships with, what can I get out of this? And where can my needs be met? And I think the danger is, the moment our needs stop being met, then that relationship ceases to be of any use to us. And so relationships become very, very disposable. And so, our heart for marriage is really completely the opposite. It's, what can I give to this relationship? How can I serve my partner best? How can I love her and value her? And, if you're both mutually doing that, then that's just the most beautiful place to be. So,
yeah, I would say actually that whole message of the other person completes me is probably how I went into marriage. But then also the cultural messages, what is this relationship doing for me? I had a lot of people in my workplace saying, well, you've basically been abandoned by your husband, so you can do what you like. And I was fed that message by a lot of people for a long time. And so I do think culturally we can be quite selfish about our relationships. And I think that's partly why we wanted to have a chapter called Grace is Dying to Self. And we also have another chapter as Grace is Championing the Other, because actually it's as you look to see how you can fulfill the other person's needs, and you see how they flourish, actually it helps you to flourish as well. And it does seem countercultural, but it actually does you a lot of good when you're giving of yourself to the other person. You benefit as well. And that's something that we've come to learn and understand and practice. And so we really wanted to make sure that came out in the book as well.
Yeah, no, they're great, really good chapters. They're all very good chapters, but I did particularly think, those are good messages for people to hear. So on that note then, I'm saying about good messages for people to hear. Who should read this book? Who should be reading Grace-Filled Marriage by Claire and Steve Musters?
Oh, everybody.
That's it. That's the end of the interview. Marvellous.
Yeah.
I would actually say it's not just for people whose marriages are in crisis. Obviously, our story, we went through that. But as you say, we've got lots of other different people's stories. And we all, one of the first things that we say is marriage is hard. Yeah. We all go through difficulties. And I think just expecting that life's going to be rosy all the time just sets us up for disappointment. So I think it's just as helpful for people who feel that they've got a healthy relationship. And just as Steve was saying, we take time out just to ask each other those questions. Actually, if you do feel like you need help, hopefully it will give you some ideas. If you feel your relationship is healthy, then it can just give you some discussion points of let's just check up and see how we're doing in every area. Let's have a look and see what this book says and what it suggests. But also for couples, I mean, we're quite keen. We do marriage preparation for couples in our church, and we're quite keen that people don't enter marriage quite so ill prepared as we were. And actually it is really good for couples who are maybe newly engaged or are looking to get married, just so that they have their eyes opened a little bit. Because when you just got engaged, you're in that romantic flush. We'll never argue, everything's going to be wonderful. And actually to be able to gain some wisdom from some people who have a bit further down the line from them, and actually we will have those inevitable struggles, and just to see how different couples, not just us but the other couples we put in there, how they've dealt with different life scenarios, is just actually really helpful. I think we do all need all the help that we can get. We need to encourage one another, so hopefully that's what our book will do for people.
Just say, we're just so grateful that these other contributors have been equally vulnerable and honest about their own challenges in their relationships, because as you say, I think it just helps open up the whole topic that marriage is tough, and your challenges might not be the same as our challenges, but there may be something in there that resonates with you, and even just, it's the sort of book we wish we had read before we got married, as Claire said, just to open up our eyes, and just to see how you can work through even the toughest trials that come.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, how wonderful. Sorry.
No, go on. You say, that's fine.
I was also going to say, but also say how wonderful marriage can be.
Absolutely.
It's not all about just the trials.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah. But I think it's really important what you've said, because you talked about an MOT earlier and that checking in, and I think it's very easy just to assume that you kind of wait for things to go wrong before you get help. And it's like you said, the car, maybe it's not such a great comparison, cars and marriage, but the idea that I have used it actually myself before, so I'm, but that idea that when you've got a car, you do what you have to do to make sure it lasts as it should do, and it works as it should do. You don't bother putting oil in it, or just letting rust build up, or whatever it might be. And I think that so often, again, in marriage, there's a sense that people either feel the pressure they should be able to get it right from day one, or they should just know, and nobody talks about this anyway. So I think pointing out that yes, it's for couples who maybe are going through struggles, but for couples who just say, actually, this marriage means everything to me. This is important. It's foundational to me and us and everything that we do. Therefore, I want to do the best I can with it. So reading your book would obviously, as you say, just be a great kind of option for them, just to help them get on the right tracks. Just one last question, really. Just what advice would you give to couples? I think perhaps your advice would be, when you're starting out, make sure you read something like your book, or do something to invest. But for couples who are feeling as though they're struggling in their relationship right now, what would you say to them to do?
I would say, don't try and hide it. Don't try and paper over the cracks. If one of you is recognizing it, try and take that time to communicate with the other. I think one of the things that we talk about in our book is that sometimes one in a couple can be a bit more emotionally aware. I mean, Steve said he's had to go on a bit of a journey to understand a bit more about this. But if you know there's a problem, don't just ignore it. Communicate with one another, but obviously being gracious and kind as you do so, that you are, and remembering you're both on the same side, that this is a relationship for both of you. But also, I mean, we've talked a lot about finding people that you can trust, that you can be open and honest with, and that's really important. I think if we try and see our marriage like an island, that actually we have to be completely self-sufficient, it's so much more difficult. That actually it does take the support and love and input from those that we trust. And so I would say, try and find those people, be open and honest with them, and be the same for others as well. But also, if you do feel like actually we're not sure we've got those people, or we've got some really big problems, we feel like we might need a bit more help, don't be afraid to ask for professional help. I mean, we said we saw that couple for a week, but we also had counselling together. I had some individual counselling after that time as well. I think we can feel like, oh, we'd never do that, or we don't want to get to that point. But actually, as you say, marriage is such an important thing. It's so foundational to our lives if we're married, that we're in it 100% of the time. Why not do everything that we can to make it work? And so if you feel that actually professional help could be something that would benefit you, go for it. But just don't be scared to speak up and start talking.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant. Claire and Steve, thank you so very much for telling me your story, for talking about it here today. It's just really inspiring, and I'm genuinely sort of moved by it, and making me think about things for myself as well. So thank you for that. So Grace-Filled Marriage by Claire and Steve Musters is available for you to buy now. I would encourage you to do that. Go to Claire's website, which is clairemusters.com, to get your copy. Thank you again, both of you, for being on the Relationship Hub. It's just been great, and all the best with the book as well.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for all your support. And another reason why you should buy our book is because Michaela's written the foreword, which was, thank you again, fantastic. So
pleasure.
We really appreciate all you've done for us. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, bless you. And please do like this episode, this video, and share it with others, and of course do subscribe to the channel The Relationship Hub. Thank you.